Africa, known as the last economic frontier, we keep hearing about the scramble for African resources. Of course, we are offering great yield, we're offering great growth as well. And of course, given that we're seeing so many problems coming through from the developed world in terms of the fiscal situations and the scenarios that are playing out, what is the most attractive thing about Africa right now?
Africa is actually going through a very interesting period because its correlation with the global Western world is kind of falling apart in a positive light. While you're having concerns about sovereign risk internationally, in Africa actually it's the reverse. We're seeing sovereign risk appreciate, or the perception of the risk actually come down, and therefore rates across Africa have been falling. So Africa is a real interesting opportunity right now. Also, you're starting from a much lower base, and you fundamentally don't have the single biggest problem that a lot of the developed world has, and that's a lack of credit. We can't have a credit crunch until we have credit, and right now we don't.
Well, just looking at all the resources as well, because Africa has great resources, cotton, coffee, cocoa, sugar. I mean, those are some of the soft commodities. We also offer gold and copper and various other commodities as well. We also know that China has quite a lot of interest in the likes of Africa, but I think that's changing as well. It's not only about China, it's not only about the US, but it's about other leaders also coming in and other investors looking at Africa as an incredible destination. And of course, as you mentioned, credit being a very big issue for Africa right now.
Yes, I would add to that by saying it's also Africans themselves. We are growing ourselves, we are consuming our products, we are putting more pressure on what food security, on land, and that's creating its own internal demand that will kick in. So it's not just a matter of us being the future breadbasket of the world or the provider of natural resources to the world. It's about us actually providing ourselves with those resources. And that's the big change. I think we've woken up to the reality that we need to consume the finished product, not just sell the raw materials.
Okay, so what sorts of investment opportunities are you going to be talking about during the conference over the next 2 days? What are you going to be highlighting about Africa to potential investors?
Truly some exceptional opportunities across the continent. This is a Pan-African conference. We'll be having banks in Nigeria, banks in Kenya, banks in Zimbabwe, all offering their own attractiveness. In Nigeria, clearly you want to play valuation. Valuations in Nigeria are very depressed still. There's no reason why UBA should not be trading at +2 times book, given it's the depth of its franchise and the growth potential in Nigeria. In Kenya, you have great retail stories like Equity Bank that will be presenting as well. On the non-financial side, you have also great stories such as Safaricom, such as Zambeef, that will all be presenting as well, that offer great growth opportunities, particularly on the point of consumer demand pickup across Africa.
Well, just looking at some of the challenges that most investors face when coming into Africa, obviously you're dealing with many countries, 53 countries on the continent, and very different from a political perspective as well in terms of the way that they operate in the regulatory environment. Obviously that's also going to be quite a big topic of conversation at the conference.
Yeah, but you know what we're going to demonstrate is actually a lot of the political risks being associated with Africa tend to be exaggerated and historic. For example, Nigeria and the corruption index is lower than Russia. For example, 79% of all Africans live in what the Freedom House will classify as free or partially free countries. So we have improved a lot in terms of our political backdrop. That's not to say we don't have issues, but we have improved significantly. And I think a lot of people will see that the political risks have probably been exaggerated as they exist today.
Well, you mentioned the likes of Nigeria, Kenya, of course Zimbabwe being quite an interesting country as well. A lot of interest coming in for Zimbabwe purely because it's at the point where we are going to start seeing incredible recovery, and the political risks have also been basically ironed out. What kind of countries are going to be under the spotlight? I mean, you also mentioned the banking sector, the likes of the telecom sector also under the spotlight. Yes,
in there you've got some great telco stocks, because when you look at Zimbabwe, you have to look at the Zimbabwean, not the politicians. And those are some of the most educated people in Africa. They have some of the best infrastructure in Africa. So they've had a very tough period under Mugabe over the last couple of years. But the core essence of the Zimbabwean public is still very, very attractive on a Pan-African footing. So you have great consumer names such as Delta, Econet, that offer great stories for investors on a long-term view.